What's up, everybody? Nick O'Dwyer back with you for another episode of the 10th inning. In today's episode, I will be giving you my top 10 running back seasons of all time. I've already given you my top 10 quarterback seasons of all time. I'm trying to get as many top seasons of all time out before the Super Bowl starts this Sunday. Now, for running backs, rushing is the main thing they'll be doing, yes. But I did not just look at the top 10 rushing seasons of all time, because if I did, this list would be much different. This list would have all of the 7 players who have had 2,000 plus yard seasons. Now, this list has most of those players. Not all of them made the list though. And because running backs, there have been so many good seasons, I have 4 honorable mentions plus my 10, so 14 total players, and I'm only limiting to 1 season per person. So, before I get this video started, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you want more of this content. Now let's get started with my honorable mentions. First, Marcus Allen of the 1985 Oakland Raiders. In 16 games, Allen had 1,759 rushing yards, 11 touchdowns, a 4.6 yards per average, yards per rush, 555 receiving yards, 3 receiving TDs for a total of 2,314 yards, 14 touchdowns, 3 fumbles, and 144.6 total yards per game. Good numbers, right? Not good enough for me to put in the top 10. Next, we have, this will be a controversial one right here, because, yes, it's a top 10 rushing season of all time. Probably the best rushing season of all time. But the amount of fumbles this guy had, I couldn't put him up there. Eric Dickerson of the 1984 Rams. In 16 games, 2,105 rushing yards. That's the record. That's what every running back aspires to get. 14 rushing touchdowns, 5.6 yards per attempt, 139 receiving yards, 2,244 total yards, 14 total touchdowns. But what really did it for me was 14 fumbles. He had the same amount of touchdowns as fumbles. That wasn't good enough for me. That's why I put him in the honorable mention category. Next honorable mention, Emmitt Smith. In 1995 for the Dallas Cowboys. In 16 games, 1,773 rushing yards, 25 rushing touchdowns, which at the time, that was the record. 4.7 yards per attempt, 375 receiving yards, 2,148 total yards, 25 total touchdowns. But again, someone like Dickerson, he had a problem with holding on to the ball. 7 fumbles that season and 134.25 yards per game. So, not bad at all. Once again, I just didn't see him cracking the top 10. Last honorable mention, another 2,000 yard rusher, Terrell Davis for the 1998 Denver Broncos. In 16 games, 2,008 rushing yards, 21 rushing touchdowns, 5.1 yards per attempt, 217 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, 2,225 total yards, 23 total touchdowns, 2 fumbles. Great numbers right there. 139.1 total yards per game. But he was just a rusher, and there's nothing wrong with that. You're a running back for a reason. But when I'm looking at this, I take into account receiving, because if you're an all-around back, you'll most likely do better. So let's get into this top 10 right now. At number 10, the most recent player on this list, the 2019 Carolina Panthers running back, Christian McCaffrey. In 16 games this season, McCaffrey became only the 3rd player in NFL history to get 1,000 rushing yards and 1,000 receiving yards. Joining Roger Craig and Marshall Faulk as the only other 2 players in NFL history to have a 1,000-yard rushing season and 1,000-yard receiving season. So, Christian McCaffrey, 1,387 rush yards. Not that special. 15 rushing touchdowns, 4.8 yards per attempt. 1,005 receiving yards. Again, only the 3rd player in NFL history to do that. 4 receiving touchdowns for a total of 2,392 total yards. 19 total touchdowns, 1 fumble all season. That's great. And 149.5 yards per game. McCaffrey, he was in the MVP conversation throughout the first 8 weeks of the season. He has to be on this list. Yes, Lamar Jackson completely dominated the last 8 weeks of the season, so he took over. But Christian McCaffrey really made a strong name for himself this season. Made himself a legitimate target for that MVP. So he's on this list at number 10. At number 9, the 1977 Chicago Bears running back, Walter Payton. In 14 games, not 16 games, Payton, 1,852 rushing yards, 14 rushing touchdowns, 5.5 yards per attempt, 269 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, for a total of 2,121 total yards, 16 total touchdowns, but 11 fumbles. That's where it did it for me. 11 fumbles. That's why he's so low on this list. Yeah, great numbers in only 14 games. Maybe could have gotten a couple more touchdowns, but hey, these are all around amazing numbers. Almost 150 yards away from 2,000 rushing yards, almost 300 receiving yards, and 151.5 yards per game. You have to be on this list. If it weren't for the 7 fumbles, he would be higher, but I had to take that into account. That's why he's number 9 for me. At number 8, one of the greatest running backs of all time, to go along with Walter Payton at number 9, the 1997 Detroit Lions running back, Barry Sanders. In 16 games, Sanders, another one of the 2,000 rushing yard club. He's the first person in the top 10 that I have on this list. 2,053 rushing yards, 11 rushing touchdowns, 6.1 yards per attempt. 6.1 yards per attempt. Think about that. That's incredible right there. 305 receiving yards, 3 receiving touchdowns, 2,358 total yards, 14 total touchdowns, 3 fumbles, 147.4 yards per game, total yards per game. Now, 14 total touchdowns, that's where I see it. That's where it comes for me, why I don't put him any higher than this. Because he had an all-around great season. He was maybe, along with Gale Sayers, the most elusive back of all time. He was a joy to watch. I wish I could have seen him in person. But Barry Sanders, 1997 season was special. He could have been on here for multiple seasons. 1994 was a great season too, but I only put one player season per list on. So 1997, he eclipsed 2,000 yards. That has to be the season. At number 7, possibly the most impressive one in my opinion, the 2012 Minnesota Vikings running back, Adrian Peterson. Now, Adrian Peterson, 16 games, off of a torn ACL and a torn MCL. 2,097 rushing yards. So close to getting that rushing record. 12 rushing touchdowns, 6 yards per attempt, 217 receiving yards, 1 receiving touchdown, 2,314 total yards, 13 total touchdowns, 4 fumbles, 144.6 yards, total yards per game. Again, kind of like Sanders, not as many touchdowns as you would like, but Peterson, I ranked this one higher just because of the manner in which he did it. You're coming off a torn ACL and a torn MCL. That's ballsy, dude. I had to give it to him. That definitely shows some bias in what I'm doing, but I don't care. Adrian Peterson has to be up there. Adrian Peterson's number 7 for me. At number 6, in the 1963 Browns, you could have made an argument 1965 was better. I went with 1963 for the Browns, Jim Brown. In 14 games, 1,863 rushing yards, 12 rushing touchdowns, 6.4 yards per attempt, 268 receiving yards, 3 receiving touchdowns, 2,131 total yards, 15 total touchdowns, 7 fumbles though. That's where the downfall is for me. Kind of like Walter Payton. That's where the downfall is for me. In 14 games, great numbers, but 7 fumbles in 14 games, that's not bad by any means, but that's a fumble every 2 games. You take your good with your bad there. Jim Brown, one of the best running backs of all time, if not the best running back of all time. He's got to be here. 1963 for me was just a little bit better than 1965. So he's on here at number 6. Now we get into the top 5. At number 5, I have one of the 2,000-yard seasons that might be one of the most underrated 2,000-yard seasons because this guy, yeah, he was good for a couple years. He was great for a couple years, you can say. But this was his real year. Out of every other 2,000-yard player, they were great for other seasons. This was the one season that this guy was truly a superstar. In 2009, the Tennessee Titans running back, Chris Johnson. In 16 games, 2,006 rushing yards, 14 rushing touchdowns, 5.6 yards per attempt, but 503 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, for a total of 2,509 total yards, 16 total touchdowns, and only 3 fumbles. 156.8 total yards per game. Chris Johnson, if you got to watch him in 2009, it was special watching him. One of the most underrated seasons of all time. This man was a joy to watch. Speedster through and through. If you were a Titans fan, even if you weren't a Titans fan, watching him every week that season was such a joy. He's in my top 5. He had such an incredible season. You can't argue with the production he put up. He was the Titans offense that season. So Chris Johnson has to be here. Going into number 4, I have a 2,000-yard rusher, but I did not use his 2,000-yard season. Let me just go over it. It's O.J. Simpson. 1973 was his 2,000-yard season for the Bills. That season in 14 games, 2,003 rushing yards. First player in history to get over 2,000 rushing yards in a season. 12 rushing touchdowns, 12 total touchdowns, and 7 fumbles. Only 70 receiving yards. Not that impressive. But in 1975, I think O.J. Simpson just had a little bit of a better season. 1975, 1,817 rushing yards, 16 rushing touchdowns, 5.5 yards per attempt, 426 receiving yards, 7 receiving touchdowns, 2,243 total yards, 23 total touchdowns, 7 fumbles, for an average of 160.2 total yards per game. Again, this isn't the best rushing season of all time. Otherwise, of course, 1973 would be on here. But this is the best running back seasons of all time. 426 receiving yards to go along with 1,817 rushing yards. You're a true playmaker at that running back position. You have to be on this list. 7 fumbles is the only reason I don't think that's the number 1 season. But 23 touchdowns to 7 fumbles. Not a bad ratio whatsoever. But I think these next 3 players just had such great seasons, it's hard to argue with it. At number 3, for the Kansas City Chiefs in 2002, Priest Holmes. In 14 games, Priest Holmes, 1,615 rushing yards, 21 rushing touchdowns, 5.2 yards per attempt. Add on to that 672 receiving yards, 3 receiving touchdowns, for a total of 2,110 total yards, 24 total touchdowns. But the kicker for me, 24 total touchdowns, 1 fumble. 1 fumble with 24 total touchdowns when you have over 1,500 rushing yards, over 500 receiving yards. How can you not be on here? In only 14 games, remember that. He almost had as many total yards in 14 games as O.J. Simpson had in 1975. He was an animal from every direction. If he got to play 16 games, he easily could have been the number 1 running back of all time for individual season. But he didn't, so I have to put him at number 3. At number 2, the 2006 San Diego Chargers running back LaDainian Tomlinson. In 16 games, 1,815 rushing yards, 28 rushing touchdowns. The record. That's the record. He beat it. I don't think anyone will ever beat that for a rushing touchdown. 5.2 yards per attempt. Add on to that 500 plus receiving yards, 3 receiving touchdowns for a total of 2,323 total yards, 31 total touchdowns, again, a record, 2 fumbles. That's over 15-1 touchdown to fumble ratio. 145.2 total yards per game. That's the only argument you can make to why he shouldn't be in the top 5 is his total yards per game. And if that's what your argument boils down to, you kind of already lost. So, LaDainian Tomlinson, great season, a touchdown record that will never be broken. I can confidently say that. He's at number 2. But the number 1 running back season of all time goes to the St. Louis Rams 2000 running back, Marshall Faulk. You could make an argument 1999 when he went 1,000 and 1,000. He should be there. But I think 2000 was just a little bit better. In 14 games, yes, like Priest Holmes in 02, 14 games, 1,359 rushing yards, 18 rushing touchdowns, 5.4 yards per attempt, 830 receiving yards, almost got 1,000 yards there again, 170 yards short, 8 receiving touchdowns for a total of 2,189 total yards, 26 touchdowns, total touchdowns that season. Again, like Priest Holmes, the reason though I put him at number 1, 26 touchdowns, 0 fumbles. He did not fumble the ball in 2000. Marshall Faulk, during his prime, may have been one of the best complete running backs of all time. And he had 156.4 total yards per game. He was one of the most complete running backs of all time. 1999, 2000, just incredible seasons for him. But I think the 2000 season tops all of them. So, there you have it. That's my list for the top 10 individual running back seasons of all time. Now, I know not everyone's going to agree with me. So let me know down in the comment section where I messed up, who you would have put in your top 10 for running back seasons of all time. In my next video, I'll be going over the top 10 wide receiver seasons of all time. So stay tuned for that. For Nick Dwyer and the 10th inning, see you.